All right, everybody. So I've been at this sport for about 30 years, 20 years of it, 20 plus years racing professionally, and, still kind of dabbling in it with the professional races and vet stuff here and there. This is probably the most important suspension setup advice that I could give someone if they want their bike dialed in perfectly. And it all starts with the rear shock spring. Okay. So I've been guilty of this, and we all we want to believe we're a certain weight, but we're, a different weight. What I find is I've ridden people's bikes that are brand new. I can hop on a stock 250F off the showroom floor where the shock's never been touched, and guess what? That bike feels pretty dang good to me, even though those sag numbers are not within the sag range that I should be in. I'm probably at 125, 130 with sag. And the reason for that is because the bike is balanced. And balance starts with your rear shock spring. Okay. So what we have is this is the stock beta spring, too soft for me. Okay. I got a 6.1. This is a 5.5, I believe. But what we need to check and the first thing we need to pay attention to is our shock preload. Okay. So what we do is we take the spring without any weight on it and we measure. So this is 247 millimeters. When we take our shock off, and we're cranking it down, we're putting whatever shock springs within our weight range, we need to make sure that we're between 5 millimeters and 12 millimeters of preload, 7 to 8 millimeters being the most ideal. So the shock that I have on right now is right at 8 millimeters of preload. Before this, I went off a spring rate chart and I went a little too soft, and I had about 16 millimeters of preload. Bike felt pretty good until I got to a really rough track, and I felt like the forks were just beating me up. It wasn't actually the forks, it was the shock, because I had too much preload on the rear shock. It was topping my rear end out and pushing every bump I hit, it was pushing a lot of weight into the front end. So when we are getting a new bike, and if you're not within that specified rate range, I have my buddy Colin is right within that specified stock rate weight range. And I've told him before, I said, that stock suspension is meant for you. He can take a bike off a showroom floor. He's about 160, 165 pounds, and it's perfect. And he's actually got his suspension done by companies before, and it's made it worse. I was like, you should have just left it stock, man. Stock suspension nowadays on these bikes is really stinking good. I mean, you can fine tune it with some tuners, but the stock suspension on, production dirt bikes nowadays is good. Yes, it can be better. But the struggle that I have is because of my size and weight. I end up spending a lot of money on springs. So to get the correct preload, it is not the way I am dressed right now. Okay. It is what I weigh with gear on. So throw all your gear on, grab a scale. I'm 205. When I have gear on, I'm 230, 235. So when I initially put that 5.9 on, I went off of my 205-pound weight, not counting in the weight of my gear. I was too soft, too much preload. Bike did not handle correctly, did not turn as good as it is now. I mean, it was okay, but with the 6.1, the correct weight range for me with all my gear on. And the issue with this is we have people that take they wear a tool bag, they take water with them, they have knee braces, chest protector, helmet, boots, and then whatever else, they could have those full body armor suits. So, you got a guy that's 250 pounds, and then now he's 325 pounds. And when you have too much preload on your spring, a thing called coil bind can happen, where basically the coils are hitting each other before it's allowed to use the stroke of the suspension. So if you're putting a bunch of preload on your shock and these coils are coming close together, when you're riding, yeah, your bike's going to feel like crap because you're basically bouncing off of your own spring instead of using the compression or the valving inside of your shock. Okay, so like I said, you measure it out. You measure your spring out, 247 millimeters. So 247 minus 8, I want to be at about 239 millimeters is going to be the money spot. And yes, there's a range. If I went to, 236 millimeters, I would still be okay on that spring. But like the last spring I had on, I was at 16 millimeters of preload. And when I got to a really rough track, I was like, this bike is beating me up. I don't know what's going on. And it had nothing to do with my valving. And it was having the wrong suspension spring. So if you are overweight, you go pick up a brand new bike and you're just all jolly to go ride it, don't even touch the sag. If you're 200 pounds, leave it alone. That bike from the manufacturers is going to come with that 7 to 8 millimeters of preload, and it is going to be balanced. When you start, if you're a 225-pound guy and you're like, oh, I need to get 103 millimeters out of my sag to make this bike feel right, guess what? That bike is going to feel way worse than if you just left it in those stock settings. So when you do get the spring, the rear spring figured out, what you need to do is, if you're doing this on your own, or, if you're kind of low budget racing and you're doing your own springs and stuff, once you figure out what the rear spring is for your weight, and you can call these companies and just ask them, be like, hey, this is what I am with gear on. They will get you in the right spring rate range. Tell them your skill level and they will match it to your front forks. Okay, he's on a 6.1, he needs 5.4 front forks. Okay, and then you'll have your suspension pretty dinged out. I mean, with the, I do believe there is a big value in getting your suspension valved, but if you got whacked out springs on your bike, it doesn't matter what you do to the valving. You're going to be coil binding on the rear spring, bouncing all over the place, and then you're going to be riding super low in the stroke on the forks. So like I said, step one is figure out this rear spring, figure out what weight range you are and what spring rate you should be running, and then you start from there. And then you will, and sometimes stiffer is softer. And I learned that when I went to stiffer springs front and rear. It actually made my bike feel more plush and softer and go through the rough stuff better. And it wasn't beating me up like it was when I had too soft of a spring. So it's almost reverse thinking. But yeah, this is probably the most important suspension advice I could get. Pay attention to your preload range on that rear shock spring. Make sure you're within that 5 to 12 millimeters, ideally 7 to 8 millimeters, and then start from there. And it will save you a lot of headache, and your suspension is going to feel pretty dang good, even with stock valving.